Welcome to a special update on China. This is a recording that I'm doing following a trip that I've just done in China, where I visited 14 companies in a period of about just over a week. And the purpose of the trip was to try and get an understanding of how business works in China, and most especially just to get an understanding of what the regulatory environment is like for Chinese individuals and more especially Chinese businesses, following what we all thought was kind of a clampdown from the regulators in China on businesses, especially tech. Most famously, when they shut down Jack Ma from Alibaba, and we just noticed that he disappeared from the public light for quite a few years. Interesting to note that he's back on the stage again and promoting his business and China as a whole. And so I visited these companies on a trip arranged by one of the big fund managers from South Africa, Ford, who have their head office in Singapore. And what's interesting about Ford is that they have based themselves in Singapore for the last 25 years on the vision of their founder, who felt that the world was moving eastwards, and equally that the Western media, Western fund managers, the Western researchers had a very jaundiced view of China. And so he moved himself out of South Africa and relocated a lot of his business to China. And so traveling around Singapore, Macau, Shenzhen, and finally Shanghai with a group of Asian fund managers and Asian analysts was a real privilege and also eye-opening. And so this is just really some observations and sharing some interesting stories. I think it's important to say, based on one research trip, we don't change our whole fundamental investment outlook. And certainly we won't be shifting all of our portfolios to Asia as a result of the trip. But I think what it does do is it gives us a bit more insight into what's happening on the ground. And certainly you can't become an expert on an economy that big with so many people and so many businesses after one trip. I dare say it'll probably take 2 or 3 decades to become an expert on China. But what is important and what was eye-opening is how advanced China is. And I'm not saying the whole of China is advanced. Like South Africa, it's a country of many different segments, and what they call their tier 1 cities. So the cities that are large, modern, and growing rapidly are, I would argue, the most advanced cities in the world. It's noticeable when you land in a place like Singapore, how organized, clean, new, and well-structured it is. And going from a place like Singapore to a city like Shenzhen or Shanghai, you feel a noticeable leap forward. I joked to my wife when I got home that it felt like I'd flown 10 years into the future, landing in Shenzhen and Shanghai. And I think that's true. It's a phenomenal ecosystem that the Chinese government have created there. So standard of living for the average Chinese person in those cities is rising rapidly. What's also important to know is that the infrastructure-led growth in China has certainly shifted. One of the ways that you would, if you took your economic textbook and you said, we've got a low growth, backward kind of country, what do we do? How do we spend our money to get that country moving forward as fast as possible? Economics 101 says you build buildings, you build ports, you build rail, you build roads, you build schools, you build infrastructure, you do all the physical things to make the country move goods and people more quickly. And certainly that's what China has done for a very long period of time. And that's partly what drove the commodities boom around the world, and South Africa benefited from that. However, they can't get that kind of infrastructure-led boom perfectly right. So what we see now is that they probably built a few airports too many. They built a few buildings too many, maybe some power plants that aren't necessary. I think it's fair to say that they've probably got 50% more power on their grid than they need. Just consider South Africa as a contrast, and you get to understand the scale of what they've done in China. But what's noticeable now is how the focus is moving from building infrastructure to building a better life for the average Chinese person. So the Chinese government works in 5-year plans, and certainly where they are now is that they're focusing on how to make the quality of life better for all Chinese, and kind of raise the benchmark for their middle class and make the middle class more accessible to more people. And we need to understand scale here. I don't think it's possible for us to conceptualize how big the Chinese economy is, but to give you some kind of an idea, their middle class is estimated to be about 300 million people. That's just slightly smaller than the whole of the American population. So If you talk about, 10, 15 years ago, the American consumer, the American middle class was the engine and the powerhouse of the global economy. When the American consumer was financially stable and in a good frame of mind and had positive sentiment, it was very good for the world. And now that will become the Chinese middle class. And they are consuming and growing in a way that is very similar to what you would see in the US. So it's interesting to note the proliferation of niche coffee shops, for example, barista-driven coffee, interesting artisanal foods, plethora of very good high-quality cars, hotels that are being built, that are of a very high standard. You see hotel groups going from 0 hotels in 2017 to 2,000 now, with the plan to go from 2 to 4,000 and potentially 5,000 in a period of 5 years. So what we're seeing is that the consumer in China, the middle class consumer, is feeling wealth effects in a positive way, is able to actually stop saving all their money in cash for a rainy day, and is actually able to see a positive and better future for themselves. And that's exactly what the American dream was. And we're watching that unfold in a slightly different way in China. And as an investment theme, that's a phenomenally important thing to take note of. It is a different political structure. And so, yes, that there will always be differences in the way that China grows and the way that their regulators work. But at the same time, human beings are pretty universal. We all want a better life. And once we're able to feed and clothe ourselves, we start to look at the small purchases to make life better. And if we feel significantly wealthier, we start to look at bigger purchases like cars, like better housing, more holidays, overseas travel, etc. And certainly that's the tidal wave that I think is starting to build now. And we need to be alive to the fact that that's what's being built in China. And I think one of the things that struck me was there's been a huge amount of focus from the Americans on China's exports and making it more expensive for the Chinese to export to America and maybe limiting their trade. And I think we're missing the boat if we think that that's going to have a dramatic impact on China. But potentially 20 years ago, it would have been catastrophic. But you've got 300 million consumers in the country who want more cars, more specialty coffees, more clothes, more buildings, more houses. That's an enormous consumer base that feels increasingly wealthy, that feels increasingly prosperous, and they see a very bright future for themselves. And so the Chinese consumer will buy a lot of the goods that are produced in China. And that's a fundamental shift from what we saw some time ago. And it's worth noting that, that will only grow. We will only see the Chinese middle class expand. And at a base of, let's say, 500 million people, it becomes, not too different in size from the whole of Europe. And that's just their middle class. That doesn't include the ultra wealthy and then the poor people. And we do need to see that, China is not a homogeneous thing. When you travel in China, you notice rapid urbanization. I don't think that will slow down, but equally that you notice, education standards are high and improving, and research and development is already advanced and accelerating. And so, to label China as one thing and to think that all Chinese are similar and they're all of a certain economic standard would be a gross mistake. And what was eye-opening for me was when you go around China and you talk to the leaders of businesses, and I saw companies like Tencent. I saw Wuji, which is a biologics company. I was in a self-driving taxi driven by Pony AI, right through to some generative artificial intelligence businesses, mega casino groups in Macau. What is really noticeable is that Chinese businesses look at the world very differently from how we would think. They're not externally focused. They are hyper-competitive with each other. So if you drive around China, and especially in those tier 1 cities, you would notice many hundreds of different brands of cars, and most of them unfamiliar to us in South Africa. The Chinese motor manufacturers that we see on our roads are a tiny fraction of what's available in China. And it would be a real big mistake for us to believe that all of those cars are cheap junk. A lot of the cars that are made there are incredibly high quality and weird, or maybe not weird to them, but weird to us, that we'll see companies like Huawei, who, we would think are cell phone manufacturers and telecoms infrastructure manufacturers. They make fantastic cars, but they don't make them under their own brand. They make them on contract. And so, you can drive a car that's the equivalent of a Rolls Royce, but it'll cost you 1.5 million rand. And it's as good from a quality point of view as anything in the world. And that's being made in China for Chinese consumers. So thinking that the Chinese are only interested in export-driven growth would be a real mistake. I think that was maybe the China of 5 years ago, certainly the China of 20 years ago. What we see today is very different. It was also interesting to see the real optimism and can-do attitude of Chinese entrepreneurs. The founder of many of these companies are the equivalent of a Steve Jobs or Bill Gates. These are hyper-focused, incredibly intelligent, global standard experts on their industries. And you've got tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of these entrepreneurs who are operating in an ecosystem that is incredibly conducive to entrepreneurial drive and entrepreneurial capital. And to give an illustration, in a place like Shanghai, the municipal government will create pockets of land where they'll build infrastructure that's suitable for tech businesses. In that infrastructure, you will find office space for the developers, very light industrial space when you're building robots, and then accommodation of a very high standard for the techies. So you get this ecosystem, which is driven by municipal, let's say the equivalent of provincial and national government. And all of that is on a drive to get the Chinese businesses going and to create the environment that is conducive for great entrepreneurs to build fantastic businesses. And when you talk to those entrepreneurs, they're not looking at, if you're a generative AI business, they're not looking across the pond at America and believing that their biggest competition is OpenAI or any other American company. They believe their biggest competition is sitting next door. It's the other entrepreneur who's equally bright, equally motivated, equally educated, and building as fast as they are. And for me, certainly the electric vehicle space is one where you realize if there was a race, if the world is in a race to get to autonomous electric vehicles, the Americans and the Europeans have already lost that race. You can, if you'd like, just do a little bit of Googling and look at some of the YouTube videos of a company called Pony AI, who build fantastic driverless cars. And the interesting thing about this is they're not building the whole vehicle. They build all the infrastructure required to take a very well-built electric vehicle and make it driverless. And if you contrast that with the US, where you've got really Tesla trying to do something similar, the Chinese are not trying to do it. They've done it. I drove around in a driverless cab, autonomous cab, very safely. It was certainly better than I could drive, and probably better than most Uber drivers out there. And in an environment where you've got lots of cars, mopeds driving on pavements across the street as wild as any South African taxi. And these cars are designed to cope with all of that environment. So the only thing I didn't experience was potholes. And I know South Africans tend to say, autonomous driving will never work in South Africa because of the taxis and because of the potholes. Well, let me tell you, tens of thousands of electric and petrol scooters going all over the place are far more variable and far wilder outcomes than a bunch of taxis. Certainly, mopeds much smaller and much more nimble. And when it doesn't respect the rules of the road, an autonomous car needs to be, very aware, and which they are. But let's see what they do with potholes. I suspect that's not as much of a problem to a driverless car as you think. And so just understanding that the regulatory environment in China, for example, is already complete for driverless cars. All of the issues that are restraining autonomous driving in America are dealt with in a place like China. So now you've got an ecosystem that creates the ability to build and design the stuff. You've got the ecosystem that from a regulatory point of view is proactive in helping you to get your product on the road. And then thirdly, a huge focus on safety. So it's not as if you're operating in an environment where the regulators are creating lax rules and where people are being killed on a regular basis by driverless cars. Safety is an incredible concern of theirs. And so I think we must just understand what's going on in China right now is a highly advanced segment of the Chinese economy that's advancing at a rapid rate. And just from a regulatory point of view, the American government, for example, is probably 8 years behind the Chinese government on autonomous driving. So now, with the way that Trump is operating, he'll make it very difficult for the Chinese to export cars to the US. probably equally difficult for autonomous driving to be opened up by the Chinese in the US. And so what you'll find is they will impose, kind of barriers to trade and therefore protect their industry, which is already 5 to 8 years behind. And all that's going to happen is they're going to fall further and further and further behind. And a company like Tesla is already behind many of the great Chinese operators. And that's just one following what, if we look at the field of robotics, for example, some of you might remember that the first robo vacuums that would clean most of your carpets and tiles was an American brand. I dare say I don't think that there are American branded robo vacuums anymore. They're all Chinese. And the reason is because they're ahead again on the field of robotics. If you could have a look at a company called Mech Mind, it's Mech MECH-Mind, and have a look at the robots that they have built that are operating in factories all around the world, and they are hyper advanced and operating at kind of real high speed. And you contrast that with the humanoid version of a robot that Tesla is trying to build, and it's far behind. The reality is that the Chinese ecosystem, with their artificial intelligence, with their programming capability and their technological capability, they already own many aspects of the robotics market. I mentioned the robo vacuums. I would say the same for the drone market. There aren't drones available in the world that are not Chinese, that you just don't find them. I would guess that if you've got a swimming pool, the likelihood is that it's no longer made, that your pool cleaner is no longer made anywhere except China, and it's very good. It's high quality. So just to understand that, made in China nowadays doesn't necessarily mean cheap, and it probably means well priced, not necessarily bottom of the range pricing anymore. Very high quality and advancing in technology and capability. And that maybe brings me to the conversation around artificial intelligence and the availability of chips. So if you follow the news, you'll see that the US is trying their level best to stop NVIDIA, Taiwan Semiconductor, and even AMSL from providing the machinery, the chips to the Chinese government and maybe to Chinese companies to advance their own artificial intelligence efforts. Now, the interesting thing about that is it's not as if the Chinese companies are sitting idle. You've got companies like Huawei that are on a massive drive to get to parity with the US manufacturers within 3 years. In the interim, though, what was noticeable to me was the approach to teaching their artificial intelligence engines. The Chinese don't do it in the way the Americans do it. What's noticeable is the Chinese are always resource constrained. They don't have access to the quantum of chips that the Americans have. They don't have access to the capital that the Americans have. And so they need to do things more intelligently and more efficiently. And so they train their artificial intelligence in a very different way to the way that the Americans do. And maybe just to use self-driving cars as an example. So with Tesla, Elon Musk takes hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of Teslas, fills them with cameras that observe what's going on inside the car, outside the car, records all that data, feeds all that data to his autonomous driving algorithms, and so builds a form of artificial intelligence based on visual. In other words, based on what the cameras observe and what the car is picking up from its own telemetry around speed, et cetera, et cetera. And so over time, these Teslas are observing huge amounts of information, and that information has to be recorded, deciphered, and then used to teach the artificial intelligence. It's a very difficult, laborious, and very inefficient way of teaching artificial intelligence. The Chinese, for example, would create a model of the world. And that's certainly what they did with Pony AI. Their argument is if you teach the machine to drive the way that humans drive, then what you've done is limited the machine to drive as well as the best human can drive, but not better. And unfortunately, for most of us, if you take a bunch of very good sensors in a car, radar, LiDAR, and all the other tools that are available, and you put it together with very good software, there is a very good chance that the software will drive better than 99% of humans, if not all of humanity. So the Chinese, or the Pony.ai, a way of dealing with things is create a model and then allow the robots to learn from the model and then test that in the real world, which is what they've done quite a few years ago. And those cars are now operating very efficiently. And as I said at the start, probably better than what we would see in the average human drive. Certainly better than I could ever drive. And so I think that's, it's interesting to see how when they're resource constrained, they operate in a different way and more efficiently. And the other thing that was interesting for me was spending time with Tencent and realizing that Tencent is an enormous ecosystem of companies. To give you an idea, there are more than 700 companies within the Tencent group. And these span across a range of spheres, and the ability to use your WeChat app to do things like order food, save money, order a taxi, get on a train, do some banking, call your friends, look at music or listen to music, look at video content. All of that happens in one place, in one ecosystem. And this is not done in a kind of a copy and paste approach. Tencent already have something like 48,000 patents. They spend just under $10 billion per year on research and development, and they're only getting started. And to contrast that with what's going on in the States, where universities are being attacked, intellectualism and diversity of academia is now discouraged. I think it's just concerning, if I was American, to look at the advantage that they had, where they were bringing in the world's best and brightest students and trying to keep them in their universities and then keep them working in the country thereafter. That whole trend is reversed. And you're seeing that in places like India and China, where the best and brightest might still go and study for a little while longer. In the US, actually, already they attempted not to go, but they're returning home. And they're returning home to a supportive government, a supportive environment, and ecosystem where they can launch fantastic businesses that will clean up the Southeast Asian and then global markets in a very competitive way. And so for me, if I had to summarize, I would say the US has already lost the robotics race. If we look at generative AI, which is kind of the pinnacle of AI for the moment, the Chinese companies that use AI in their businesses don't brag about it. It's just another tool for them. They think it's unremarkable. And if you look at the American companies, it's almost all they talk about is, how can we AI ourselves and AI our businesses? And they view it as an end. And the Chinese simply view it as another tool to make them more competitive, more efficient, better companies. And equally, that they believe that there is only one American AI engine that works incredibly well on the level that some of their businesses do, and that would be Gemini. And so they don't even view ChatGPT as a competitor. They think it's kind of old technology and far behind. And so worrying about chips when you've already lost the race is just an interesting concern. And I think also just understanding how much the health system of China is kind of impacting the rest of the world. A company like WuXi, and I had to learn how to spell that, so it's WUXI, WuXi Biologics, does research development and manufacture of biologics drugs all around the world. And this is the most advanced, cutting edge part of medicine right now. And they dominate. They already have a 60% market share around the world. They have labs all around the US, Europe, and then all the way into China. Walking around one of their labs, it was astonishing to me to see that they employ in one lab 180 scientists. 75% of those scientists have a master's level, 15% have a PhD, and those are from universities all around the world. And that's one lab in one small company. And that scale of research and development is just, I think, unparalleled. And so I think, understanding maybe South Africa's view on why we would focus on a one China policy, for example, and why we're happy to antagonize the US and definitely happy to antagonize Taiwan, it starts to become a bit clearer to me because there is an enormous future in China. I would say in conclusion, it's been a long episode already and I'm sure you're tired of my voice, but I would say in conclusion that we're certainly not going to take all of our global money and allocate it all to China or even India. I haven't mentioned India, but that's running in parallel to China and competing equally hard. And I think that what is important is that, we will still allocate half of our clients' assets to global indices, but the half that's not in an index, in other words, the actively managed money, we have for quite some time already been allocating money to value managers and especially managers that allocate money very differently to what the index does. And that means just by definition, we've had an overweight allocation to China and India as a result. And certainly I come back from a trip like this going, that I think is a very good decision. I think that China is certainly very business friendly. It's very investor friendly. What they don't like is companies that act against the good of the consumer. So, in the States where you see, social media companies doing their best to kind of make their users addicts and, get into doom scrolling on Instagram, playing little games, hour after hour and not focusing on schooling or relationships, etc. The Chinese government doesn't want that behavior in their country, and they take drastic steps to make sure that won't happen. And I think you can argue about the methodology of how they do things, and that causes uncertainty. And then the media will say they're uninvestable. I don't think that's true. I think they're highly investable. But what you have to know is it is an autocracy. And there are good arguments to wonder if the pinnacle of democracy right now is the US and the pinnacle of the pinnacle is Donald Trump, then maybe a little bit of autocracy to make the greater good work for most people. There is an argument for that. It's certainly a different conversation for another day, but I understand much more now around why people in China, Singapore are happy to give up some of their freedoms, because actually those freedoms come at a huge cost in the form of inequality, etc. And I think in South Africa, we wouldn't mind a little bit of more draconian laws around crime and corruption. And certainly you can see that unfolding in a place like Singapore where crime and corruption result in a swift death. And certainly that's dramatic. Interesting to note how the average person's life in Singapore is pretty good. The average person's life in China is improving all the time and probably already better than what we would see in South Africa. So it gave me a lot to think about. It's certainly, I'm very comfortable that the managers and investments that we've selected that do allocate a disproportionate amount to China and India are doing the right thing. I think that it's an investment thesis that will unfold over a 10 to 20 year period. I'm not saying that we're going to see huge growth over the next 5 years from China specifically. I think it's a long-term story, but it certainly reminds me a lot of America coming out of World War II when the middle class became an economic powerhouse. And I think we're watching that unfold now. And it is, a 10 or 15 year story to observe very carefully. Thank you for watching. As I say, this isn't, kind of actionable information that you should follow immediately, but certainly might explain a little bit about why we have the views we have. And certainly for me, it's worth trying to consume, media in a kind of a broader sense to understand that there is a lot going on in the world, and if you ever get the chance to go to a place like China and explore their tier one cities, I think it's worthwhile doing. The kind of word I've used over and over again is it's overwhelming and very advanced. And so thank you for your time, and we'll keep these up when we do.